All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marissa Brandt, and I'm executive co-chair for the University of Minnesota's Women in Technology group. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our fall event. I'm also delighted to introduce to you our speaker for this afternoon, Karanja. Caroline is a designer, developer, and a cultural architect. She's the founder of 26 Letters, a SaaS e-learning solution that helps companies understand and incorporate diversity and inclusion. Her deep experience working with engineers to build technology products gives Caroline a unique perspective on the workplace. Prior to founding 26 Letters, she guided culture and inclusion initiatives at fast-growing startups with a focus on virtual companies. Her academic background is rooted in cultural and social studies and their application in the private sector. In addition to thanking Caroline for coming out to speak to us this afternoon, I'd also like to thank 26 Letters, which has generously supplied the food and beverage for this afternoon. So can we just have a round of applause for that? In addition to the refreshments, there also is some swag at the back of the room on top of the piano if you want to check that out after the event. Also, if you're tweeting about the event, our hashtag is UMNWIT. Please use that for tweeting. Now, please join me in welcoming Caroline.
Thank you for that introduction. And by the way, if you can't hear me in the back, just wave and I'll see you, and then I'll get closer to the mic. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to be here. So this is my second time on the U campus this fall. The first time was with a collaborative event with Lean In, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and hence all the swag towards the back there. So it's swag from that event. Feel free to take as much as you'd like. But I just want to give them a shout out for the leftover swag that now we all get to enjoy. All right, so I'm really happy to be here today at the U, and thank you for taking the time to listen and grow with me around this topic. I'm encouraged to see and be a part of an event such as this. When I started coding, these were far and few in between. As was mentioned, my name is Karanja. I'm a developer, and since going independent, I've been working specifically to build software that helps increase accessibility and equity around town, whether it's with nonprofits or startups or the city of Minneapolis. My goal is to help organizations that are really focused on increasing accessibility create digital and technology solutions that can do just that. I'm also the founder of 26 Letters, which is a diversity and inclusion platform focused on helping organizations build inclusive, diverse, and engaged workforces. And so really helping them kind of know how to recruit, retain, and grow top talent, diverse talent for the modern workforce. Diversity, however, is not really usually a word that you hear when you imagine the tech industry, right? And so when we think about tech giants today, when we think about tech giants today, we're really thinking mostly about these individuals for the most part. I have to say this is my favorite picture right here of Jeff Bezos. We're thinking about Bill Gates, we're thinking about Mark Zuckerberg, we're thinking about Jeff Bezos, Snapchat Spiegel, Elon Musk, and there's something that this does to the current imagination about what really tech looks like, right? And it really obscures a more diverse and nuanced history of tech, as well as the present moment, and really kind of puts a shadow on some other individuals that need to be part of the forefront here. So these faces will come across most people's minds when they think about the industry, but again, who's missing, right? So whose narratives aren't pictured on here? And how are these stories being left out, and to what effect? I'd like to take the chance today to kind of address some of these questions in my talk from Ada to Zuckerberg. And first, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself first. So this is a picture of myself, and this was about 2 years ago at a hackathon called Hack the Gap. How many of you here have heard of or participated in Hack the Gap? Awesome. Yeah, so this was the first event. And this was at a startup out of the warehouse district. And I remember the whole weekend being really excited and fascinated by the fact that there were, about 50 women in the room, all building really, really cool software. If any of you were there, I mean, it was everything from something to measure brainwaves to an app, and that was really exciting. But when you look through kind of my personal story, the participation in an event like this would have been incredibly unlikely. So I'm an immigrant. I moved to the US in 1999. And prior to that, I'd never used a computer, and it was rare for me to even kind of come in contact with one. And we didn't get one in my house until I was about 11 years old. Now, we had computers in schools, of course, the Apple ones with the colorful backs, but I didn't really use the technology for anything other than writing papers. That was until senior year when you had to be invited to Facebook. I don't know how many of you remember when you needed like an invite from a college student to get onto Facebook. So anyway, aging myself a little bit here, but that's how I ended up using tech for something more than writing papers, was signing up for Facebook. And so this kind of made me a little bit more curious about technology, right? The idea of applications, and this curiosity led me to learning how to code. And coding was fun, but again, it was really mostly a form of procrastination. I was trying to avoid writing a thesis paper for college. It turns out that it has many applications. Avoiding my homework was part of it. It turns out that's how Mark ended up with Facebook as well, so I guess we have that in common. But when I started coding, it was mostly really simple websites. And when I think about, what that time was like for me, what strikes me the most is the ease to which I was able to be involved in tech. In part, I realize now that this is because I didn't really have an overarching narrative of what people in tech looked like. My entrance into programming was as much connected to my curiosity, my love for math and science, as it was really a casual chance. And I began programming when I wanted to kind of create a site to go along with a project, which I'll touch on in a little bit here. But again, it was just super casual. I didn't have any hang-ups about who belonged, who didn't belong, because I didn't really take it all that seriously. And so, because I was so disconnected to technology as a child, I wasn't plugged in enough to notice who was represented in tech and who that representation suggested belonged there. By the time I found myself coding, I had already had, a really strong sense of self. And kind of this was all really from like my absence of tech, and I hadn't really internalized the idea that for me as a Black woman, as an immigrant woman, I wasn't encouraged to participate as a producer in this space. I didn't notice any other women of color in technology, but I also didn't necessarily notice the white men either, right? And so, in my head it was like, well, why not get into coding? No one's kind of putting any barriers up for me. My story, though, is fairly uncommon in this way, right? So when I began coding the fact that I began coding uninfluenced by kind of an overarching dominant narrative around me is even rarer now than it was back then. And it wasn't until I was really involved in coding, my relationship with technology went from something that was more personal and casual, more of like a hobby, to something that was a lot more professional, that I really began to see these narratives and these messages, and they became completely unavoidable. But many other people did grow up with this overarching narrative. And some of these narratives about what it meant to be in tech and who belonged in tech affected the lives and experiences of some individuals. And when you have an idea of who belongs and who doesn't belong in particular spaces or professions, this inherently affects how we relate to these fields and how we relate to our colleagues in those fields. So many women are either directed to entering and then quickly exiting tech, or just internalizing the absence. We end up kind of not seeing that we belong there from the very beginning. So this is Tess. This is a real story. She currently works as an engineer, and she's a fairly prominent voice in technology in the tech scene. She built her first website when she was 11 years old. She started selling code about a year later, and she took 6 semesters of computer science in high school. She had 2 internships by the time she was a freshman in college, and this image of her is her soldering at age 6. I don't know what you were doing at age 6, but I was not soldering. Yes, that was not soldering. And so you'd think that for someone like Tess, who has had a relationship with tech, has had technology be such an integral part of her life for such a long time, wouldn't necessarily be affected by this dominant narrative. But she was. She got an internship at Microsoft, and she writes in a blog post about how one of her friends told her that she basically only got it because she was a woman, and actually she makes somewhat of a point to point out that that there were various tracks for internships, and she got into like the internship that was just the overarching one, not even one to support diversity within Microsoft. But after she kind of kept hearing this over and over again, she started questioning her own skill set. Was she even a valuable member of the team? Like, was this really something that she was meant to be doing? Was she even good at what she was doing? And of course, imposter syndrome sets in. She starts to really kind of question more and more. And stories like these are not uncommon. This is something we hear more often than not. This is Philip, another real story. Philip talks about the technology privilege he had as a young Asian man in the scene, right? So he started coding in 11th grade, so junior year of high school, and ended up in MIT's computer science program. Philip had the privilege of implicit endorsement, so people assumed that he knew what he was doing because he, quote unquote, looked the part, so to speak. People gave him internships, assistantships, and jobs because, above all, they saw that he had potential. And he states that his ability to learn and be successful in the field wasn't because, it was really because he didn't face a lot of kind of the implicit, he calls it implicit discouragement, that many other people of color, women, and others who are often marginalized in this sector face. People thought that he could do a good job, so then he did a good job. At the very least, people were assuming that he knew what he was doing. So if he didn't, they gave him the space to kind of figure it out. And this, of course, is not to downplay his success or his skills or abilities or the hard work or anything like that. But it's really to highlight the environment in which success took place for this particular young man, right? In which his abilities were really fostered. Imagine if the same kind of supportive environment existed for everyone in tech. Imagine the skills, the ideas, the relationships that could flourish as a result. I share these two public stories because they set the stage for how most people experience technology. And while binary might be a foundational code to computing, the questions of who has a place in tech, who are the changers, who are the engineers, the coders, who are the users, we must break beyond those binaries. Both Tess and Philip were affected by the overarching narrative and the biases that are baked in the industry. As I started to do more and more work in tech, I was deeply troubled by kind of the homogenous environment that I found myself in. At the same time, I was studying cultural studies and looking at visual representations within specifically Bono's Red campaign, and the mainstream media effect perceptions of certain populations, and how this also affected policies that were being implemented and how resources were being distributed, particular to this campaign. Right, and this is like a whole other talk. It was like my college baby. I absolutely loved working on this project. So this is kind of the lens through which I think about a lot of things, right? And it's kind of the lens through which you'll see a lot of the stuff here from Ada to Zuckerberg. So in a world now dominated by pixels, you'd think that we'd have a much better understanding of how images affect us, and our understanding of ourselves, of each other, the wider world around us, both present and past. These images inform how we understand our present moment, but also revise our understandings and assumptions of the history that has brought us here. Has tech always been for and predominantly white men? So let's look at a brief history of tech and some of its most unsung heroes, movers, makers, and shakers. So I know you're wondering, who's this lady next to Mark? Her name is Ada Lovelace. So she was born Ada Bjorn in 1815 to the famous poet Lord Bjorn. She invented, quote unquote, the first machine algorithm for an early computing machine that only existed on paper. And it's a really fascinating story about how she came about through this. If you have a few minutes, I would definitely look this up. She worked closely with some of the brightest thinkers of her time. She kind of had a really great she definitely had some math skills behind her, right? Just kind of like some natural abilities around math that helped her lay the groundwork for tech as we understand it today. And the detail of, who her father was, and kind of later her marriage to William King, who's English royalty and scientist, is important, not because we should define her necessarily by the men in her life, but because this really is like the social context that brought about her success, right, and her ability to actually have the space and the time and the resources to do what she did. So what skills and ideas can really thrive when, again, we give people the space and the resources to explore them, and when this person is encouraged to do so? I think that's part of Ada's story. This is Katherine Johnson. She worked for a division of NASA in the mid-50s. And women who worked for NASA, they were mostly known as computers because they did most of the computing for the program. And she was so good that in 1962, John Glenn, who became the first person to orbit Earth, requested that she personally recheck the calculations made by the electronic computers. Right? And so some of you might recognize in part her story. This is Elsie Shutt. She founded Computations Incorporated, or Comp Inc. It was one of the first software companies in the world, right? So she started this company in 1958 and worked mainly with large government organizations like NASA, Army Corps of Engineers. Comp Inc. was mostly staffed by women, right? Over 50 women kind of came through this company. And it gave them the opportunity to learn about technology and to get involved in technology. I personally didn't know this story, and I think that to have one of the first software companies run and founded by a woman is something that's really significant, something that I think we should sort of elevate more and more. Right, and so this list of women continues to be significant. We have Margaret Hamilton and Mary Jackson, and we can go down kind of a larger list of individuals. But beyond these women, right, there are countless more that remain nameless but integral nonetheless. During World War II, most of the people doing computation, or at least the time those jobs were known as desk computers, were women. They were unsurprisingly able to be hired for less money than men, but also given the fact that they were largely barred from battle, they were charged with the computing and problem solving behind the scenes, and thus beneath the glory. After World War II, many of these women went on to program the most advanced computers at the time, almost all of which were government funded. So clearly women haven't simply been a part of the conversation, but have often led the conversation. So what exactly happened here? Why is the field and its history not imagined to be positioned by women, not imagined to position women at the forefront as a significant actors in the advancement of technology? So we see something really kind of start to change. So this is a chart from NPR. I'm sure a couple of you might have seen this at some point. So as you can see here, it shows the percentage of CS degrees given to women go from the 1970s all the way to the early 2000s. So the red line represents computer science. As you can see, there's an increase of degrees over in the early 80s. 84, it's about 34% of computer science degrees go to women. Suddenly, there's a sharp decline, and we see it go to about 30% in 1990, 26 in 1998, and about 12 in 2001. And some data shows that as low as 10%. And the other thing, too, obviously, is that some of the other law schools, physical science, medical school, all kind of steady off at around 40-ish, 50-ish%. So in the 70s, right, computer science was really common in a lot of colleges, a lot of universities. And there was this underlying assumption that most students didn't have experience with computers. So for the most part, teachers really started with the basics. You just walked into class, you assumed that no one had, a computer at home. You started from kind of the very beginning. And so what this meant was that everyone was kind of starting from the same field, so to speak, from the perspective of the teacher. In the 1980s, we see computers enter the home, and not really for practical or professional use, but we see them as toys. Like most toys during this time, there's a strong gender preference. Computers are marketed to boys, and parents bought them for boys. Here is a commercial for Commodore an Apple computer. Do we have sound? Maybe? Hold on a second. Yeah, if we can get the sound, then you'll get the full gist of the ad.
Brian Scott made a career decision. He decided to be an astronaut. His first giant step, learning to use an Apple. There are more Apple IIs teaching more subjects in more schools than any other computer. Everything from alphabet
Brian
lessons
Scott
for
made a
preschool
career decision.
to
He
science
decided to be
programs for graduate school.
An astronaut.
All right, so
whatever
let's
Brian
just
wants
start
to
over
be,
really quickly.
An Apple personal computer can help him be it. As of this afternoon, that's a marine
This morning,
biologist.
Brian Scott made a career decision.
The
He
Apple
decided to be
There's no telling how far it can
an
take you.
astronaut. His first giant step, learning to use an Apple. There are more Apple IIs teaching more subjects in more schools than any other computer. Everything from alphabet lessons for preschool to science programs for graduate school. So whatever Brian wants to be, an Apple personal computer can help him be it. As of this afternoon, that's a marine biologist. The Apple II. There's no telling how far it can take you.
And so I don't know if you can note there, but there's clearly kind of a really gendered narrative that they're trying to tell, right? So Apple computers in this scenario are for boys. It's for them to it's a tool through which they can kind of fulfill their own personal missions, whether it's to be an astronaut or an engineer or whatever it is that they want to be. But this is kind of a tool and a resource for them to take command over and go ahead and fulfill that dream or that wish. So movies start to kind of play a role as well in gendering this industry. And so they come out with images of stereotypically young men being socially awkward, usually white, who use computing to help solve their own kind of personal problems. Unsurprising in cinema, men are still positioned as the heroes, but can be heroes in a way that isn't hyper-masculine and doesn't require physical strength. The computer joins the rank of the sword and the gun, but the damsel in distress still is there, right? So that narrative doesn't really change. The historical reality that women have been computing and solving problems in the world and has saved men for years is quickly erased by this spectacular Hollywood narrative. The representation of a computer programmer was cemented during this time. Because more boys had more access to computers, the media had more access to computers and a media machine encouraging their use, young men became more likely to enter computer science programs and ended up most often with the familiar programming upon kind of their coming to age. So here's the Commodore 64 commercial to kind of reemphasize this idea.
Commodore 64 lets you play hundreds more games than any video machine, plus draw, program, even do music.
I absolutely love watching these old ads. All right. So just a quick note here, the shift in computer science culture clearly affects women, but the underlying assumptions tell me that if we look at data where people of color, where we're looking at people of color and low-income individuals, we see a similar pattern, right? So the internalized notion of who belongs, who possesses perhaps a natural or quote-unquote biological, see Google engineer manifesto here, inclination towards computing affects anyone not included in that narrative. So these commercials are a good idea of what that really looks like. And so through the 90s, we continue to see these ideas really persist. There is a really great Microsoft Windows ad there, and I'm not going to play that one, but essentially Jennifer Aniston tries to use the computer, and the woman who's teaching them how to use Bill Gates' computer tells her that she better not mess anything up. It's a really long, it's actually their how-to on Microsoft, and again, it's kind of like reiterating these same narratives around this. Same with the Mission Impossible, my apologies. Same with the Mission Impossible ad, and even in the movies, right? We kind of see this re-emphasizing of man and machine and computer, and how they're able to use this as a tool. And so much like a snowball effect, if your parents worked with computers and you had a household with a computer, or you went to school with computers, you now had the knowledge of programming and entered any workforce computer science program, you were instantly ahead of the curve. And we continue to see the same representations on screen, off screen, and so forth. And so, there aren't many representations outside of that, as we see we continue to see kind of the same types of things, where it's predominantly white men, predominantly using computers for their own means. And so we started to create this loop that we now have found ourselves in, where there's a lack of diversity in technology because there isn't as much representation. Because there isn't as much representation, there's a lack of diversity, so forth and so forth. And so movies like The Social Network and shows like this one both come out in these cultural moments that are being defined by a lack of representation and defined gender roles, and they continue to invest in the dominant narrative of our current moment being defined by much of the same. One of the primary shifts in the 70s and today, which has laid foundation for these cultural shifts, is the privatization of computers, the hardware itself. Right, and so when personal computers enter the market, the relationship between the computer and its users change. So, this relationship starts to shift from the government and organizational one to one that is largely public and imagined or intended for the public good, to something that's more of like a private relationship. So when a young man spends all evening playing the Commodore 64, he begins to own the computer. And by ownership, I don't mean just that it's the boy's personal property, but also that he has a level of control over it and can command it to do what he needs it to do. He's not given a task to complete that is intended to kind of meet a larger collective goal. Rather, he decides to take the task the computer must complete for him, or he must complete it by subduing the computer. So the computer becomes a more private tool for the self rather than a public tool for the whole, right? And so that's kind of the difference. When women were largely being seen as computers, a lot of these projects and a lot of the initiatives were kind of around a collective goal. And so we see this shift to something that's a little bit more private. And so, of course, with anything that tends to be more privatized, you have a concentration of wealth, which is another cycle that we're seeing now, right? Especially around technology. But we do start to kind of see some pushback in the early 2000s, and we see kind of trends and forces that are behind them, and these pushes eliminate and lift some current stories and that are being overlooked, and we see more and more women being highlighted who are in the technology field. Right, and so this is kind of a reference to an earlier slide. And so this pushback not only challenges how we currently think about the tech industry, it also challenges the rise of the industry and how that is being remembered. So who the programmers, the computers who have paved the way for where we are today. And so, really kind of what's next, right? I think one of the things that we need to think about is this process of individualizing hardware and software. I think that there's something that kind of we need to talk about as a sector about what it means to have access to, again, both the hardware, the software, internet, all those other different things to kind of create a little bit more equitable access to these resources. And so everyone wants takeaways, right? We all kind of want to know what's our quick checklist of things to do. How do we make this industry more accessible to those who haven't, quote unquote, looked the part in the past? Well, for starters, I think that talks like this begin some of that work by challenging what it means to even look the part. Women like Elsie Shutt and Katherine Johnson don't, quote unquote, look the part. So then what does looking the part mean anyways? We can write new code and we can write new parts. And the part that begins, and this in part begins by kind of illuminating just how these roles are constructed and just the important role that women have played throughout history to get us here in this moment. Beyond shifting the narrative insofar as how we talk about tech, we can shift the narrative in how we behave in it, right, and how we support one another. We can look to groups such as this, right, Women in Tech, Women Who Code, Black Girls Code, Geekettes, all those different groups, and use those as spaces where we can come together and collaborate and make it a place where we can really build each other up. And so as long as, there are gathering places such as these, doing the work kind of becomes a little bit easier and becomes more of like a collective theme, right? A collective challenge and action that we can all take together. And as we continue to do more and more of this work, we'll see more young women who are interested in tech see this landscape start to change. And suddenly imagining ourselves to be where we are now becomes a whole lot easier for us and for them. So I kind of just want to thank you all for being here and for taking the time to listen to me. I look forward to engaging with all of you in these conversations going forward, and I hope the conversations continue to change as quickly as the industry does. Remember, when women have been, even though women have been pivotal to this industry, and we really still are, highlighting a lot of these stories, being in the space, being in the place, supporting each other, these are some of the things that we continue to do in order to make this a more diverse and inclusive sector. None of us are here by chance or by fluke, so keep on coding. Thank you. Quick shout out to Target and Geekettes. Geekettes is a women in tech group, and I am the ambassador here in the Twin Cities. So if you want more information about that, let me know. Target, just always thank them because they in part help support some of the things that you see here. So, any questions? This is the conversation part.
If you have questions, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you so it can be streamed as well. Anybody?
I have a kind of easy question. You've mentioned Geekettes. Can you tell us how to get involved in that and how to find that community?
Yeah, so that one's fairly easy. If you just email me at that email, I'll get you added to the email list and the events.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Is there
That was
another
another.
I get the sense that your presentation is about us and how we can impact the IT environment and such. But I think one of the biggest challenge is really the environment. As you kind of talked about, really you covered about the history and how the environment changed women's access into the field. What can be done in the environment? I mean, there's actually a lot of stuff out there for women now as resources, but you also have to address the other part, which is the environment, and it still exists.
Yeah, so I think that's a whole other list of points of interaction, right? I think the one thing that often doesn't get discussed enough is pay gaps. Google is going through this right now where, there's clear discrepancies between the salaries that men are getting versus women for the same types of positions. So doing salary audits, I think, is one thing that companies can do right off the bat. Doing audits around promotions. When it comes to code reviews, there are plenty of research that has shown that even though a code review is supposed to be somewhat objective, code reviews by women are significantly, they tend to get turned down a lot more by their male peers. And so I think for companies and for managers and supervisors, and even for colleagues, being super aware of some of those things can have a much needed change, right, around like just access and resources. In terms of being super practical, there's some really great training around workplace inclusion. That's what we do at 26 Letters, is help organizations identify specifically their areas of opportunity. Definitely creating platforms for women and other folks who are often marginalized to be able to talk about their experiences in ways that don't affect their professional advancement. So there's a study that showed that only white men aren't affected whenever they talk about bias in the workplace, right? And so if we know that, Black women in particular, you're 7% less likely to get a promotion if you talk about this stuff. Volunteer groups around diversity and inclusion, same thing. They overall have an adverse effect on everyone except for white men. So how can we create spaces where we still encourage this type of sort of collaborative work around this work, but then at the same time not put other people's professional well-being at risk? And I think a lot of that has to go to organizations and companies putting real resources behind this stuff, not just a volunteer-led group around D&I, but actually putting in some work and putting some measurements behind it, whether that's tying this to people's bonuses around their feedback and practices, whether it's, again, doing audits around pay gaps. And I actually think that's a super straightforward one, but it's one that's, I think most organizations might be a little bit hesitant to do because it might point out some things that they just weren't ready for. And so yeah, there's a whole list of things. I have a lot of thoughts around that, but I totally agree. And this talk is really meant to put some context around why tech looks the way it does now, not necessarily around kind of the behaviors of tech in particular, but I think that's a really good point.
I have 2 questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted you to talk a bit about your transition from college to where you are today, and what you do at 26 Letters. And also, what advice will you give women who are discouraged from the industry, women of color especially? Who are discouraged, like, by the because industry. When people are talking down on you and telling you, oh, this is not for you, look for something else to do, like, when you're not getting encouragement, you're not getting people supporting you, people are telling you you're not good enough, like, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll address the first one really quickly. The transition was more organic than I think most people realize. So like I said, I didn't learn how to code for the purpose of doing this professionally. I did it to procrastinate. I'm really not joking about that. And so I think my introduction to tech and coding was different. Like, I had really specific goals about what I wanted. I wanted to build a website for my friend who's a poet. I wanted to create a web platform to talk about the Red Campaign stuff. And I think that's one way to get into tech, is by finding a problem that you want to solve for personally, and that will usually give you kind of the drive around it. And then the added kind of the plus around that is then you can use that as part of your portfolio. This is something that you created for yourself. In terms of staying in the industry, even when you're not necessarily being encouraged to stay there, I think that, this current sort of generational workforce might be the one that starts to help to set the standards and create sort of that very clear conversation around these issues. And so I don't necessarily believe that, for me in particular, that I'm necessarily going to like reap the benefits of a really inclusive work environment in the tech industry. But I'm hoping that some of the people that I talk to who want to be part of this will actually reap that. And so the way that I address some of that discouragement is really focusing on working on projects that I'm passionate about. So like I said, any freelance work that I pick up really focuses on accessibility and equity, because those are 2 things that I'm passionate about. And for me, working freelance has been really helpful because I can put myself in my own little bubble to do the work that I need to do, and not necessarily kind of have to face I think a lot of the challenges that people who are in an environment with other people can. But that being said, I know that that's not an option for everyone. Being part of communities such as this and finding out what are the real places that are actually good to women to work at, and talking to other women about that, because I guarantee you we all know what those things are. And I don't want to call out the company that kind of has been the black sheep in all of this, but Susan Fowler writes that when she was interviewing at Uber initially, she was told that they told her that it was a great place for women to work. But then literally the first person that she mentioned that to, who ended up being her husband, he was like, oh no, that's like the worst place to work. And so really going outside of the company, but actually figuring out from women and other individuals, like what are some of those places that really care about this stuff? They may not be perfect, but they're really trying to put work and effort towards this. It's not a toxic environment, and they're open to listening to other people's thoughts and suggestions. Finding out what those companies are, those organizations, and again, surrounding yourselves with women and mentors and other individuals who are supportive of you is kind of the best way to survive in this industry and hopefully at some point thrive.
I'm coming. Sorry, Heather. Hi. Sorry.
As a white male going into computer science, what is my responsibility in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. May I ask, are you a student or are you in the workforce? Okay, perfect. So there are some schools that have actually been doing some really, really great work around what inclusion looks like in the classroom. So Harvard Mudd College is one of these colleges that kind of has frontiered what classroom inclusion looks like in computer science. One of the things that they talk about is, again, going back to the 70s, and for professors to make sure that they really are starting the classroom at a level where everyone is a little bit more, where you can really sort of start from the beginning, right? And so as a white man, whenever you note that sometimes a teacher might just kind of skip over something, right? Like you have the privilege to say, to kind of point some of those things out, whether it's in person, in the classroom, or whether it's making yourself available and accessible. I don't know how technology apt you are, but if you are kind of lending your skills to others who may not necessarily be. But paying attention to some of those things, right? So again, noting if there are some assumptions that people are making or that teachers are making, being aware of what biases are, right? Gender biases, like ability biases, and taking note of that. And so a lot of it is kind of learning and educating yourself around these issues, and then seeing how either you yourself or others around you might have some of these biases and how they're kind of showing up in the classroom, and having the language to then like have some of those discussions, whether it's again with your professor or with other students. Awesome. Cool.
So my question is from a different perspective. I come from the business world, and so living and swimming in corporations, I'll just use the generic IT is looked upon as a department or a division within a major corporation. So the question is, from that viewpoint perspective, what can women who are at the table leaning in, I call them sponsors, in other words, those senior executive levels in the business world, how can they reach out, lean in, and speak to women who are in technology? Because I'm beginning to see that everyone lives in their own silos. You know what I mean? Like education lives in one silo, health sciences lives in one silo. For this conversation, technology lives in its silo. Everybody lives in their own silos. So I'm looking at it from a mentoring perspective. Those that have that conversation, what can be done from that viewpoint? Because when I work in a company, I see IT as an avenue of, my computer is not working, can y'all please make magic and have it happen? You know what I mean? As opposed to looking at them saying, look what that portion of the industry is providing for me, to ask that question from the get-go. So what could those senior executive females, or those, to your point, sir, what can those leaders who look at inclusion from a universal macro perspective support this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's a number of ways to approach that. The first one is, I will say from personal experience, if there were people in leadership, they didn't even have to be women, who supported me in prior work environments, I would have probably stayed, right? And so I think like what mentorship and sponsorship looks like doesn't necessarily have to be from other IT professionals. It can literally just be from other leadership that see something in you and support that in you, right? And so that support can be in the form of sponsoring you to go to Grace Hopper, or sponsoring you to get an advanced degree or go through an event, or some of these other things, or encourage you to take part in talks such as these. So one of my mentors is actually the one who got me into doing more and more talks. So I think that's one way, is just kind of just showing up regardless and saying, I see what you're doing, right? And actually that's a key thing, is literally like, I see the contribution that you're making to this IT team, and I recognize it. And this is a path for you within our organization, within that, right? So part of it is that, IT has usually had more of like hallway conversations around professional advancements. And I think that's usually the case for a lot of corporate settings. And so changing what that looks like, or at the very least, making it so that women can also be part of those hallway conversations, although they really just shouldn't be hallway conversations. So again, looking at policies and sort of systems are in place that keep certain people from being able to see how they can grow within the organization. The other thing is just creating a space for women to come together and talk and have a sense of community and camaraderie. And I would say that would be across all business divisions. I remember I worked for a larger company, and one of the things that I specifically remember, and I remember very little from this organization, but one of the things I remember is we went out to lunch with two of the women who are C-level executives and a whole bunch of other supervisors and VP levels. And there was something about all of us being in the room, and it was those individuals, but then also other women that were also in the company. And I don't know, there was something about that space that felt, I don't want to say safe, because I don't think that's necessarily the word, but it felt like they were trying, and actually ended up having way better conversations with other women who were also individual contributors in the company than I did necessarily the VPs or anything like that. But it allowed me to build more community within the company amongst other women. And so creating spaces where women can kind of get to know each other, and obviously more than women, because we need allies within this journey, but specifically creating that sense of community is really important. And then the other piece I would say is having some kind of a community involvement, like outside of the company. And so whether it's supporting groups like this, U of M WIT group, or Geekettes, or Women in Tech, or all these other initiatives, kind of showing up in that way and making sure that that other women who are in your tech departments can see, like, oh, okay, company X is sponsoring this event. I want to kind of learn more about that, right? And helping them find community outside of work. Because in that way, even if they don't stay within your organization, they hopefully can be one of the people that can redirect more employees your way. So yeah.
Caroline, we have an online audience member question, which is a good dovetail with what you're talking about right now. And it's, what are your recommendations for leading from the middle in organizations, and what have you seen work?
I would say the number one thing that really people underestimate is looking at systems and policies. there is so much to be said for having bad procedures and a system in place that is inherently exclusive. If I'm going through a challenge with a fellow colleague and I don't know where to go to gain support, or if I go to my HR department, they don't necessarily respond accordingly because I don't really know what to do, or they have too much on their plate, those are the kinds of things that are immediately going to stop any kind of change. So I always tell everyone that if you don't know what your policies are around your promotion, your hiring, if you don't understand how your processes might be sort of perpetuating discrimination or bias, then that's the first thing you need to take a look at. So I would say that's probably more for like supervisors and managers, just kind of being aware of that. The next thing I would say is leading conversations around this, right? And so one of my favorite things are lunch and learns. And so if you can get, going back to your point, right, if you can get your company to sponsor a lunch and learn and either bring a speaker or watch a TED Talk or read an article and then have a conversation about it, that instantly is a place and a space where you can be a little bit more casual and actually start to talk about how some individuals might be facing challenges, or how your organization is doing something that's really cool and awesome, and that can be sort of shared around the table. And so creating, again, it's about community and collaboration, so creating, again, sort of those spaces where you can have those conversations is key. And I think that's something that anyone from any level of the organization has the opportunity to do that.
We have time for one more question. All right. Okay, over here. Here you go.
Oh, yes. So my question is, what does 26 Letters do, and how can students here get more involved? And even people who are not students, people who have graduated and have gone into the workforce, like how can they get more involved to support you and 26 Letters?
Oh, thank you. So I would say students, for sure, Geekettes would probably be the better route, because that one's all about building community and collaboration. So Geekettes, we meet once a month. We'll pick up again. We have one happy hour in December, and then we'll pick up again come February. We meet once a month, and Marissa has been to some of our events, and we have food and activities. And so it's a good place to come and meet people, and we usually have organizations there to talk about their open positions. So it's also a good place to kind of network and get to know potential employees. In terms of 26 Letters, so it's a software solution around increasing diversity, inclusion, engagement within organizations. So what we do is we have certain factors to help create a baseline for organizations. And so through that baseline, we're able to identify areas of strength within the organization and areas of opportunity within the organization. And so then we can leverage cultural strengths in order to address those cultural opportunities. So rather than saying, in general, this is what diversity and inclusion looks like, here's a list of 200 things to do, we say for your organization, your IT department needs help in these things, your marketing department seems to be doing pretty well in it, like, let's do some cross-collaboration there. So we're allowing organizations, giving them the tools and the resources to leverage what they have that makes them unique in order to, again, address those areas of opportunity. We also offer online trainings around bias and workplace inclusion and hiring practices and writing job descriptions, all sorts of different things that, again, are meant to help organizations grow and individuals grow professionally and personally around diversity and inclusion. So that's a gist of what we do there. And I'm, always looking for potential employees and things like that. So I didn't want to turn this into like a Caroline recruiting thing, but send me an email.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, everybody, for coming. In addition, we are the University of Minnesota Women in Technology, or UMN WIT, and we do, if you're new to this is your first WIT event, we do have a series of events on allyship, large events like this. We have smaller events on presenting, speaking, writing, things that we definitely would love to see everybody get involved in. We're at wit.umn.edu, and we'll continue to promote our events on campus. And once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Caroline. A round of applause for our great speaker for answering all of our questions.